That's two really great talks to follow. I really appreciate both of those. I've heard people teach Niebuhr's approaches to culture multiple times, and I don't think I've ever comprehended it that well. I actually can remember what they mean now, so thanks a lot, Mark, for that. And Ronnie, I think I agree with a lot of what you said, but I just didn't really like how you said it, and it kind of made me uncomfortable. So I don't know if I really liked Ronnie's talk that much. But my name is Grant. I'm a part of Denton North Church. I've watched a lot of y'all's sermons over the past few years online. I finally see the 105 building in context from the videos, so I've enjoyed that. Garrett has joked about how he is considered the resident expert on the Holy Spirit. And then Hannah McCarty joked that she's become the resident expert on depression, which I love that dark humor. And I feel like y'all are trying to make me the resident expert on politics, even though I keep telling James and JVR that I don't have any qualifications or experience with politics. So listen at your own risk. We'll see how this goes. But I will say, though, that if standing at square one of politics and scratching your head can be considered an expertise, then I can be an expert on that. This is going to be pretty square one. The first half of it is going to be pretty abstract and laying a foundation and a little bit heady. And then about halfway through, it's going to lock into place and become very practical. So let's get started. I'll start in a little bit of a weird place. I want to talk about the idea of evil spiritual forces. I don't understand this well. I'm pretty new to thinking through a lot of this. And we might need to tweak and refine how I say it, because I don't understand it very well. But I think we can discern it together as a community. And I think something roughly like this needs to be said. So I see it most clearly in Paul's writings. He talks about these beings, and they're not God or the Trinity. They're not the devil. They're not humans, and they're not angels. There's something else, and maybe something related to demons. So yeah, we're talking about politics. I went right to demons. But so yeah, sometimes the way that, depending on what passage you look at and what translation, they're called something like the spiritual rulers, spiritual authorities, powers, forces of evil, principalities, evil spiritual forces, elemental spiritual forces, elemental spirits, things like that. So a couple examples. In Ephesians 6:12, he says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, and powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So he's talking about these, I think, beings that are at work in the world. Another one is Colossians 2:8. "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." They also come up in Galatians 3 and 4, but that passage is complicated and I don't know how to treat it properly, so you can just read that later. One thing that I see in Colossians 2:8 is that I don't think we can make a lot of really clear distinctions between our actions and initiatives as humans and the spiritual powers' actions and initiatives. I think they kind of work together to produce the hollow and deceptive philosophy. And I think we're always participating with that, either with these elemental spiritual forces or with the Holy Spirit. I don't think there's a neutral version of it where we're just out here without being influenced. In Galatians 5:19, Paul lists the acts of the sinful nature, and they include hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. Have you heard a better description of our political sphere? Hatred, discord, jealousy, rage, ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. How different would it be if our political sphere was full of the Holy Spirit? I'm reminded of James 3:17, which says, "The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere." Wouldn't it be nice if you opened up your social media feed of choice and it was just full of people and words that are marked by those traits? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say something a little bit more outlandish. I believe that these spiritual forces of evil not only exist, but I think they're still active, and I think they're exercising immense influence over our political sphere. I believe that politics, as we know it, is one of those hollow and deceptive philosophies that depends on human tradition and on the elemental spiritual forces rather than on Christ. So in the Old Testament and New Testament, we read about these idols. There's Baal and Asherah in the Old Testament, and then Caesar and Artemis and things like that in the New Testament. Could it be that whatever elemental spiritual forces were at work leading people to make sacrifices at those altars are still at work leading us to make sacrifices at the altars of hatred, discord, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, and the like? So I'm going to introduce a term, just for the purposes of this conversation, political forces. It refers to the elemental spiritual forces as well as the humans, human institutions, and human activity that make up politics as we know it. And I'm suggesting to you that these are all in participation with each other. And so by this term, political forces, I mean to include the whole chain of participation from top to bottom. So, pundits, talking heads, politicians, news conglomerates, journalistic institutions, social media and their echo chambers, outrage culture, unfounded conspiracy theories, political movements, governments, disinformation campaigns, philosophies. I think all that is mixed up with what Paul calls the spiritual forces of evil. So I think those are all participating together and tangled in with each other. And we can't say well, this is what the humans did and this is what the elemental spiritual forces did. So I'm going to reference that multiple times, the political forces. And it's intentionally encapsulating a lot and kind of vague, or I guess broad. So is politics idolatrous? Your own Garrett Davis is fond of making extremely strong statements that it is an idol. And I don't know if I can go that far to such a strong statement, but I do basically agree with him. Garrett loves hearing that. So I don't think it's so idolatrous that if you're a Christian and then you go to the altar of Baal and sacrifice whatever, you're engaged in idolatry. I don't know if politics is that idolatrous, where if you go and vote, you are engaged in idolatry. But I do believe that politics as we know it is idolatrous in the vast majority of its manifestations. I don't think it's something you can enter into without caution and careful attention to the Holy Spirit. You wouldn't walk into a powerful river without being concerned about getting swept away by it. I think that's what politics is like for Christians. So that's the image I get of people fording a river, or crossing a river. You wouldn't do that carelessly. You're going to take each step very methodically because the current is pushing on you and you might tie yourself off to the shore. You're going to take a lot of precautions to not get swept away. So engaging in politics as a faithful Christian is like fording a river. We must take great care not to get swept away into idolatry. And on this topic of idolatry, it's easy to look back on the Old Testament in a very superior and condescending way and be like, why do these people keep worshiping these other gods? What are they even getting out of that? It's so clear that God says, worship me, and they're not obeying. And I think we partly feel that way because of a misunderstanding. Old Testament idolatry was not an exchange of gods, but an addition of gods. So they weren't, they would say, their way of thinking would be Yahweh is a great part of our heritage. He brought us out of Egypt. We love the Sabbath and these festivals where we get to take time off work. But for just the daily grind of getting by in life, Baal is really useful because we need the rain to come down. We want to be able to eat. We want military security. We just want prosperity and the good life, and Baal can really help us with that. And so we want to bring him in addition to Yahweh. And I think in the same way, the idolatry that we're tempted to is not to explicitly repudiate God and say, well, we're not following him anymore. Now we're just Republicans or whatever. We're going to bring these other things in addition to God that we're going to put our trust in and our hope in for the good life. So all this raises the question, are we led by the Holy Spirit or the political forces? I believe political forces have been more effective at forming people's identities than the church. Too many of us are a progressive, a conservative, a libertarian, a capitalist, a socialist, whatever. We're that thing first and a Christian second. And I think many of the people who that's true of don't realize that that's them. So do we shoehorn Jesus and the Bible into our politics, or does the Holy Spirit lead us into our political convictions? It's easy to deceive yourself, so how can you tell? Well, one answer is that the acts of the sinful nature are obvious. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy. Does this describe the way that you engage in politics? If you're led by the Holy Spirit, you'll sound not only like James 3:17 that we talked about earlier, pure, peaceable, open to reason, and all of that, but also Galatians 5, exhibiting love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So one concrete example of this where I feel that I've caught myself being led by the political forces before the Holy Spirit is I write my thoughts out a lot, sometimes just for my own sake, to get my thoughts straight, and sometimes because I'm thinking I'll share it with someone or share it publicly. And I found often I'll do that. I'll write all my thoughts out, and then I'll be like, okay, what scriptures support this? And then I'll start inserting them in. And it's like, what if I flip that around? What if I was like, okay, I've got all these thoughts swirling around, but the first thing I'm going to do is what scriptures bear on this topic? What if I did that first and then spent time, in prayer and meditation, discerning, God, what do you think needs to be said on this? And so I don't know that I've done a great job, but I've tried to do that more so in preparing this talk and other things as well. So we need to figure out how to have kingdom of heaven unity in the midst of political diversity. How much difference of political opinion can we tolerate within the church? It's hard. I think one thing worth considering is that the 12 disciples included both Peter and Matthew. You had Peter, a zealot, and that was a group that wanted to form a military and overthrow Roman rule. Right there next to Matthew, who is literally an instrument of that oppressive Roman rule and was made wealthy by it. And somehow, I don't know that any of us know two people who are further apart in their politics than that. Like someone, like an insurrectionist and someone who really works for and benefits from, like the oppressive aspects of the government. But they were both in the 12 disciples, and somehow they figured out how to work together to build a new kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And I think our temptation is to throw in the towel far too quickly. We're ready to leave or hate or disparage people because they support capitalism, or they support socialism, or they support BLM, or they critique BLM, or they voted for Trump, or they voted for Biden. So who are the people in your church whose political views make you angry, frustrated, exasperated, fearful, or sad? Now it's Ronnie for all of us, because he told us all how he voted. Can you imagine, if I say that, there's a good chance that some people come to your mind. Who are the people that you're like, oh, this again? So if those people are in your mind, can you imagine inviting that person into a humble, open to reason, kingdom of heaven-centered conversation about your disagreement? And when I say that, I don't want to sound dismissive of how deeply some of these political disagreements can strike us. It can really hit a painful nerve. You might be thinking, my mom or dad could have been deported under another Trump presidency. Like, do you not care about them? Or maybe you have loved ones in your life who were, like, their mothers were advised to abort them, and then they didn't, and you have this person in your life, and you're like, this is happening everywhere. Do you not care about this issue? I don't want to dismiss how deep and emotional some of these political issues are. But can we enter into a constructive disagreement about it? Could it be that a strategy of the political forces is to get us squabbling so much about U.S. politics that we neglect to advance the kingdom of heaven? And you might be thinking, my political convictions flow out of my Christian faith. I'm a fill-in-the-blank, socialist, capitalist, whatever. I'm that thing precisely because I'm a Christian and because of my Christian faith. And I'm asking you to really, really question that. Which came first? The fellow Christians that you resent on the other side of the issue, they feel the same way about their faith and their political convictions. So how are you so sure that you're totally right and they're totally wrong? That your views flow purely out of your Christian faith and that they're uncorrupted by the political forces? Because remember, the political forces have been more effective at forming people's identities than the church. And we're playing catch-up. And in all likelihood, you are playing catch-up. So has your journey into your political convictions been marked by the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. As you've moved further into your political convictions, are you getting more that way? So I said suddenly things were going to click into place, and we were going to get into practicals, and that's what's happening right now. So this is a trying time to have a political allegiance that doesn't fit into any of the teams that we're kind of offered, the blue team or the red team or whatever. And I think the kingdom of heaven is one such political conviction. It doesn't fit neatly into those categories. And we're in this river that's pushing on us and trying to sweep us away into idolatry. And how can we be led by the Holy Spirit in the midst of all these pressures? So that's what the rest of these headings in the notes are. They're how to be led by the Holy Spirit. So the first one is don't get swept away into obsessive consumption. We've used this quote, I think it was Thomas à Kempis or something, I don't remember, and I couldn't find it, but it's let our lives keep pace with our learning. Meaning, what good is it if I learn all these cool things about God, but I don't do anything with it in my life? I don't implement it or change my thinking or that kind of stuff. So I think it's good advice not to learn vastly more than you could possibly keep up with in your life. I think a lot of our consumption of political news and political commentary is way more than we can make good on in the way that we live our lives through, praying for those issues, having good conversations about them, taking action, voting, volunteering, noticing your neighbors, and all those different things we can do in life. Are you able, everything you're taking in terms of politics and news, are you able to act on it in any meaningful way? And if you're taking in way more than you can act on, then it would be good to consider dialing it back. And I think a lot of our overconsumption of news and political commentary comes from guilt, fear and anxiety, or a desire for entertainment. So on the guilt one, there can be this thing where it's like if you're not already aware of the latest horrible thing that happened and you're talking to someone and they have to tell you about it, then it's like, oh man, I should have known about that. I look like an idiot. I must be really like privileged or blind or stupid or something like that. Or we're afraid of being seen that way. The fear and anxiety is just there's a lot of ominous things playing out and people posturing that don't seem to be well intended, and we're scared of these things affecting us. It's kind of like if there's a big monster on the horizon that you see and it's like, man, is that thing taking another step closer to me since the last time I checked? I guess I need to get my phone out because I haven't checked in 30 minutes. Is it any closer to me? On the entertainment, and some of the circles that I am in my life, the way that we talk about politics is kind of entertainment. It's just like, man, did you see the latest thing they said? That was bad. That was crazy. And it's just kind of something to talk about. And you could just as easily be saying like, man, did you see what LeBron did in the fourth quarter last night? That was crazy. It's like the same genre of conversation. And I think the pandemic has made this worse because there's just not as much going on, and politics just kind of fills that role as something to talk about. And in some of my relationships where politics comes up a lot, I've been trying to intentionally have some other stuff that we talk about sometimes so that it doesn't just consume everything. So I would say consider placing firm limits on how much you consume news and political commentary, and maybe even social media and streaming media as well. I'm just going to make some shameless plugs for a few things that have helped me. One of them is a service called The New Paper, and it's Monday to Friday, very brief, factual, non-editorialized or sensationalized news bits. So it's like, okay, I've got awareness of some of this, and it's not really vying for my attention and trying to get me outraged or anything, and I can read further on some of this if I see fit. Another one is The Flip Side, and that's also like a Monday to Friday daily email where they pick an issue, and then they have columns from like both sides of the issue with like pretty lengthy excerpts from articles and stuff like that. And one thing I've really appreciated about that one is that it, for some reason, it seems like the worst versions of the arguments bubble up to the top, and that's what I'm seeing all the time. But this one kind of bubbles the better arguments up. So people on the other side, where I'm mostly just seeing the stupidest versions of their arguments, I'm like, oh, okay, well, now that I read this, I can see how they kind of have a point. There's actually better versions of the arguments that I wasn't aware of. So those are two things that have helped me. Do with that what you will. So don't get swept away into obsessive consumption. The second way to be led by the Holy Spirit when we engage in politics is don't get swept away into reactivity. When COVID first started, getting to the U.S. and becoming something that affected us directly, we all became overnight experts on virology and knew exactly who was stupid and all of that. And when this freeze-pocalypse recently came, whatever we're calling it, I don't remember, we all became overnight experts on electrical infrastructure. And it's like, I had never heard of ERCOT 3 days ago, but now those guys are evil and bad and I hate them. I was stunned at how quickly these degenerated into dumpster fires on my Facebook feed. all the finger pointing and political posturing. That's the kind of reactivity I'm saying we should avoid. One Christian cultural commentator that I really appreciate, his name is Mark Sayers, and he's from Australia. They have a church with a podcast called Rebuilders. And it's worth checking out if you're interested in something like that. But after the Capitol riots on January 6th, they didn't release a podcast for like a month. And then in mid-February, they released this really thoughtful, thoughtful analysis from a biblical perspective about what this moment in Western politics means. And in their intro, they were like, yeah, we intentionally didn't say anything for a month because we wanted to spend some time just reflecting and in prayer and reading and learning because we didn't want to get sucked into that reactivity. And I was like, oh, that is so refreshing. And then it really showed in what they had to say about it. Imagine if, your favorite newspaper, they were like, yeah, this crazy thing happened, but we don't really know what to say about it yet. We're going to do some learning and some thinking and reflecting. It's almost comical to imagine a newspaper doing that. Because they're like, no, we'd rather make money by getting you to look at this story as soon as possible. So don't get swept away into reactivity. The third one, resist the snarky, sanctimonious tone which is so common on social media. I've been trying to put my finger on what this thing is that I'm just seeing everywhere. So I don't know what it is, but I have a couple traits of it. So it's sanctimonious. That means that it's making a show of how much better you are than someone else. And it's accusatory. It's putting down a person or a group in such a way that onlookers can cheer for how you really got them. It presumes that those people are stupid, ignorant, and morally inferior. It tends to include a twist of some kind of snarky cleverness so you can really just get them. It's designed to preclude any way of answering or discussing the accusation. So it's set up where you're set up where if they answer, you can be like, oh, that's just what an old white guy would say. Or that's just what an entitled millennial would say, or whatever it is that you're going to go for. And it attempts to make the target feel like they've made an embarrassing public blunder and revealed themselves as stupid or evil, and there's no patience or grace for them. I was talking to one of my coworkers about this, and we were messaging on an app that we use for work. It was really productive. And he said something about having a Twitter account that was so good that I just copied and pasted it into here. I'm going to read you what he said. He said, I had a Twitter account for a while. I never wrote anything. I just wanted to stalk the conversation. But it made me a crazy person. It became my reality, the way that I processed all conversations. I would have a conversation with someone in my church, but I would filter it through conversations happening among influential Twitter accounts, which was not conducive to actually having a conversation with someone in my church. And I started thinking in that way. Pithy, clever little statements meant more to embarrass someone and get my team to laugh at them than to really communicate with the other person. It was like a drug. Maybe this is a temptation specifically for college-educated people of average intelligence like myself, for whom the height of culture is cleverness. I didn't like that last part. That stung a little bit too much, so you can ignore that. But resist the snarky, sanctimonious tone, which is so common on social media. Fourth way to be led by the Holy Spirit when we engage in politics is to notice your afflictive emotions and respond prayerfully. So when you feel yourself getting up in arms, getting wound up, getting anxious or fearful or defensive or angry, that's a good time to, first of all, consciously notice that you're feeling those things, and then to talk to God about it. So you might be going about your day in the afternoon and just be like, man, I kind of feel bad. Why do I feel bad? I guess I'm kind of anxious. Why am I anxious? I guess, that thing I read this morning, it kind of keeps coming up. Man, that's stressing me out, God. Like, can you help me with this anxiety and this fear? What do I do with this? If you can get to that point where you're noticing the feeling and you've brought it to God and asked Him to help you with it, that is a huge win. And when you get outraged, it's also a good time to recognize that you're in the most profitable state for tech companies and for the companies that use their platforms. I'm not even joking. You're literally in the most profitable state. I don't think anyone was trying to say, let's get people outraged so we can make money. But they said, let's figure out what works so we can make money. And then it turned out to be outrage. So be appropriately skeptical of what you're told you should pay attention to and how you're told you should feel about it. The political forces that choose and frame these issues don't necessarily have our interests at heart. So notice your afflictive emotions and respond prayerfully. The fifth way to be led by the Holy Spirit is go out of your way not to caricature others. So if you don't know the word caricature, I don't want you to miss it. It's like the guy on the side of the street that draws you, and if you have big ears, he'll make them elephant ears. So caricaturing is like taking true things about someone and then blowing them out of proportion to a ridiculous extreme that's not in reality anymore. And I believe that if you're not going out of your way to avoid caricaturing others right now, then you're almost certainly doing it. There's something about the way that we're consuming information that is making us caricature everyone. And I think this is actually provable, and I'm going to try to convince you of that in this. It's going to be slightly technical, but I'm certain that everyone can understand this, but you do need to pay full attention for just a moment. So there's a certain kind of study that researchers sometimes do where they'll craft a survey and give it to two groups of people. So let's say Republicans and Democrats. And they'll give them both the same survey, and first they'll say, answer this for yourself. What do you think about these questions? And they'll take it, and they'll give them the same survey again and say, okay, now answer what you think the other group thinks. How would the typical Republican answer this question? And they'll do that both ways. So then you have, this is like the Republican self-disclosure of their views and the Democrat self-disclosure of their views, and then what they think each other are like. And then they average those four sets, and so you can see them. And so if you've got, this is what the Democrats think, and this is what the Republicans think the Democrats think, if it lines up really well, then they've got an accurate perception. You can actually look and see how bad the perception is. So figure 1 of 1 is a graph from a study like this where they did that. And so the top chart is the actual positions, the way that they describe their own views. And they're pretty polarized. There's not a lot of overlap, but there is a good bit of overlap in the middle. But then the second chart is the perceived immigration positions. And then they fly way out to the extremes, and there's virtually no overlap. But that's not the reality. The reality is the first chart. And this isn't like a one-off thing. I think it's been repeated many times in lots of studies. This is something that's happening as our perceptions of each other are getting kind of blown out of proportion into caricatures. And it's a big significant error. It's not just a little bit. And so I think we need to be really humble about this. So what are the takeaways? Although some Americans hold deeply partisan views, Americans are significantly less divided than we've come to believe. That's a quote from one of the studies. If we're going to be people of God who walk through life with sobriety and objectivity, or who at least try to, we need to take care that we don't get swept away into this kind of delusion, thinking that people are way more extreme than they are. And if your main takeaway from that graph is like, man, those people, their perceptions are so skewed, you're not getting it. In all likelihood, your perceptions are skewed. There's a different study. The first one was from, what was it called? It doesn't matter what it was called. The second one is called The Perception Gap. And there's a website, perceptiongap.us. And it's a very similar study where they did that same kind of thing. And they actually have a quiz that you can take. So instead of assuming that you've got it all right, you can actually get a pretty objective view of like, do I see things as they are, or am I kind of caricaturing people? And that's one of the practical things I'd recommend is go and take that quiz. I wasn't able to do it myself because I read the study, and then I was like, oh, I want to take the quiz. And I started, and I was like, wait, I just looked at all the right answers. So I'm going to have to wait a little bit and then take it. And this is where I'm reminded of a quote from the movie or the TV show Ted Lasso. Any fans out there? He says, be curious, not judgmental. So that's one of my takeaways from looking at that chart. I'm also reminded of a smoke alarm analogy with this. So how many times have you dealt with a smoke alarm that's going off in your life? Probably many times, but how many of you have actually had your house burned down because of a fire and the smoke alarm was telling you about that? That happens sometimes, but it's usually just telling you about burnt toast. So you've got this obnoxious, annoying alarm going off telling you that there's burnt toast. I think a lot of times the reactions that we have when we're in a political conversation are like that overeager smoke alarm. We're hearing someone say something and it's like your racism or socialism or whatever alarms start going off and you're stressed out like, man, I can't believe they said something that stupid. But I think we've got to do, in those moments when you're talking to someone and feeling that way, we've got to do the same thing we do with the smoke alarm. You've got this blaring, incessant noise that's stressing you out and you want to make it stop as fast as possible. but you've got to keep your head on your shoulders and look around and see what's actually happening. And it's like burnt toast or whatever it is. Sometimes it's a real fire that you've got to attend to, but most of the time it's not. And I think that's often true whenever we're having these strong reactions to what people are saying politically. So we've got to ask good questions. Like, what do you really mean when you say that? Or like, where are you coming from? Like, what do you see as a good result that you're going for? Ask a lot of clarifying questions with people instead of assuming that your alarm is actually triggering what it's trying to trigger, if that makes sense. So go out of your way not to caricature others. And the sixth one is listen deeply, empathetically, and courageously, even to people who scandalize or offend you. Those three words are deeply, empathetically, and courageously. Listening to people that we deeply disagree with is going out of fashion at the moment. The train of thought is like, if I listen to this person, then I'm lending credibility to their ideas, and their ideas are evil and out of bounds, and therefore I cannot in good conscience listen to this person. And so then, if you're not listening to them, who is? It's people who think like them, and people will just float off towards extremes. But here's the thing. It's possible to look someone in the eye and say, I firmly disagree with the idea that you're advocating here, but I want to put a pin in that for the moment because I love you and I care about you and I want to understand you and I want to understand why you have this idea. And how did you get there? Like, what's your story? And if the person is really far gone, if they're saying something that is clearly out of bounds, then you could even say like, look, this idea is a non-starter. We are not going there. And I'm tempted to give an example, but I try to avoid extreme examples because they're inflammatory. But just so I'm clear, like if someone was saying like, I think we need to do an ethnic genocide. I think that's what we need here. You could be like, that is a non-starter. But I love you and I care about you and I want to understand your story and why you're thinking this way. And you can still listen to that person and offer them an off-ramp from that extreme. As the church, we are a kingdom of priests. And imagine, for me, this picture is like a Catholic priest with a divider wall or whatever, and some guy is like just heart-wrenched over this thing he's done, and then he's confessing it to the priest, and the priest is like, that's just kind of tiring and gross. Like, can we not get into that? That person's going to be like, gosh, where else am I going to go? We've got to be that last stop where the deepest and darkest sins can come into the light. Even if the sinner is not apologetic and confessional about their sin, maybe they don't see it as sin yet, but we've got to have grace for that and to be willing to listen to people and bring those things into the light. So yeah, this kind of empathy and connection is one of the only things that can present an off-ramp from a path of radicalization or extremism. And so I have a barrage of quotes on this point because it's I got to pull out the big guns for it because it's really hard. One of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 6 principles of nonviolence is that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. It recognizes that evildoers are also victims. I'm reminded of what the disciple said. This is a hard teaching. Who can listen to it? But do you hear that Ephesians verse that we started with echoing there? Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. It recognizes that evildoers are also victims. Next quote is from Longfellow, a poet. He said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. So I'll put that into 21st century English. He's saying like, you've got this person that you regard as your enemy. If you could just watch their life before your eyes and see everything that's happened to them and that they've been through, you would want to put your weapons down and just sob and give that person a hug if you saw everything that goes into their humanity. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. Next one is, I visited a church in Denton, is an Eastern Orthodox church, and the priest was, in the homily, he just said, it's hard to offend a humble person. It's hard to offend a humble person. And I was like, man, that says a lot. We're in an age where we're really proud of how offended we are at everything because it shows how good we are, that we just can't bear it. But it's hard to offend a humble person. And just to make this barrage of quotes as diverse as possible, I've got a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, something like that. There's a lot of marks above and below those letters, so I don't know if I'm saying it right. But he said, when communication is cut off, we all suffer. When no one listens to us or understands us, we are like bombs ready to explode. Compassionate listening brings about healing. Many of us have lost our capacity for listening. You can say to yourself about the other person, I'm listening to him just because I want to relieve his suffering. Even if there is a lot of injustice in his way of seeing things, even if he condemns or blames you, you can still listen in this way. I recently was listening to an interview of Irshad Manji. She's a Muslim reformer. I don't know a lot about her outside of this one interview, but she told this story that really stuck out to me. So as a woman who is trying to reform Islam, she gets a lot of opposition from extremists. And she was at a book release event somewhere, and then some of these, radicalized young men started storming into the building and, just rioting and shouting and causing a ruckus. And the way she responded was, she said, "You're in my house right now, and we are not going to act like this. Sit down, be quiet, and listen. And then you will have a chance to speak, and we will listen to you." And then half of these angry young men full of testosterone sat down and listened. Half of them didn't. They came in there to start a riot, and they continued to start a riot. But half of them, just the mere prospect of being listened to, stopped that riot half of it, dead in its tracks. And they were like, "Man, I will listen to you if you'll listen to me." These are young men who didn't feel listened to. It's like some people are going to be crazy no matter what. But if the only options on the table are shut up and take it or be crazy, then there's going to be a lot more people who choose to be crazy. But by listening compassionately, we can open up a third option. And there is something to be said for boundaries on this. I can imagine situations where people shouldn't listen to some individual, like their abuser or something like that. So I'm not talking about that, but I think pretty much everyone I know needs to be challenged to listen more when it comes to the people they disagree with politically, not less. So listen deeply and courageously, even to people who scandalize or offend you. And this last one I have is just be humble and open to reason. I don't have any more clever or thought-provoking way to say it. But in the past several years, I've had a lot of examples where I think someone is crazy or deluded or they've just been led astray by this ideology. And then when I actually have a one-on-one conversation with them in person or on the phone using our voices, I come away from it thinking, they have a lot more of a point than I thought they did. And I'm actually glad that they're in the conversation because what they're saying needs to be said. So be humble and open to reason. And don't puff your chest out or try to act like you know more than you do when you enter into a conversation. And I will say, be careful of getting a taste of what it's like to have a lot of those conversations because it can be kind of addictive when you're having high quality, mutually respectful disagreements where you both come out better. So just be humble and open to reason. So that's what I've got for you. I'll kind of summarize it. I ask you to consider whether politics presents far more of a danger toward idolatry than you might tend to think, like in the same way that the current of a strong river can sweep us away. I ask you to consider that your political convictions might be deeply misled by the political forces and in dire need of renewal from the Holy Spirit. I ask you to think about what conversations you might need to have with fellow Christians so that you can go through healthy conflict and preserve the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And to do that in a way that's filled with empathy and grace, openness to reason, and with an effort to see the humanity in the other person. Take that quiz at perceptiongap.us and see if your perceptions of Democrats and Republicans are even accurate to start with. And in all the practicals we covered, I hope that there's at least one thing where you felt a tug in your spirit that was something important for you to take away from this. And if you've got something like that, pick one of those things and go for a 5-10 minute walk, leave your phone at home and talk to God about it, ask him to speak to you, and just try to quiet your mind and to listen to the Holy Spirit. So that's all I have. Thank you.